This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I am a writer and film critic, and today I'm going to be talking to Michael Benson, the author of Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and the Making of a Masterpiece. It's a fascinating book, a fascinating read about an amazing film, as you'll hear in the conversation. Certainly one of my favourite ever films, I think. And Michael is an expert, so he's a perfect person to talk to about this. One quick note, there were some technical issues during the recording, so there's a part where the conversation is a little bit interrupted and the actual quality of the sound isn't up to my usual high standard. My standard is not particularly high to begin with, but anyway, I hope it doesn't distract you from the conversation. In fact, I'm sure it won't, because the quality of the conversation is as such that you'll be so interested in it. You'll be writing me emails saying, what problems were there? I didn't notice any problems, and that's a good thing. If you like the episode, please remember to subscribe, to like, to spread the word on Twitter and Facebook and social medias generally. This is our Christmas episode as well, so do remember to have a look through previous episodes and to look through this episode, and maybe you might want to give some film books as Christmas presents. I would heartily encourage you to do so. I have actually got a store in bookstore.com that's named after the podcast, and you should be able to find all the books that we talk about there. If you order through there, I get a tiny percentage of several cents or something, so several pence. So if you want to do that, you can do that as well. And happy Christmas. Let's also say happy Christmas. Why not? Happy Christmas indeed. And I hope you enjoy the conversation.
It's interesting you mention that, because we staged an entire EU Christmas concert here at the Cathedral in Ottawa. My wife is a senior EU official, and it was a fantastic event. Several TV cameras, choirs singing every Christmas carols in every European language. Perfectly timed, beautiful location. 1 hour for carols from every country. VIPs in the audience, blah, 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 blah. It was all supposed to be then broadcast on Christmas Eve on TV here, on Rogers Cable. And then 2 days later, we heard that something happened and the camera, we had the sound, but not the picture. I have no idea. They had students shooting it. The whole thing had to be restaged in a smaller church. The whole thing was just ridiculous. Anyway, those things do happen, but not today.
Not today. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Are you in the Dolomites?
Yeah. I'm just a little bit shy of the Dolomites, just a little bit south. The town is called Feltre, is the closest town. If you ever drink Prosecco wine.
Yeah, well, I don't, but I lived in Ljubljana for a long time, so I was very close. And a friend of mine has a small hotel up in the Dolomites. It's near Madonna di Campiglio ski area.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, I just jumped in the car to go and get some stuff, and there's a particular corner that if you turn around the corner of the mountain, and it's like entering Narnia. It just suddenly everything is white and it's just completely snowed over. We've got a little bit of snow here, but there it's just like the trees are frozen and will be for the next 3 months.
Right. Well, I'm in Canada. What can I tell you?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, you've got. Are you full of snow at the moment?
Yeah, but it's sunny.
Are you through and through Canadian? Are you?
No. I'm an American. My wife is the EU ambassador to Canada. We're here on a diplomatic mission. I'm from New York.
Oh, right.
Are you from London?
No, I'm from Liverpool. Well, actually, I'm from Cumbria originally, but Liverpool is sort of the place most people have heard of, and I was at university there for about 10 years. So, yeah, I couldn't get out. It was amazing. I was having too much fun, so I just stayed.
I was going to say, you got your undergraduate degree after 10 years. That's good. Well done.
No. I just kept adding degrees.
Oh, okay. Good for you. So you're a PhD or what?
Yeah, PhD. The got a master's in romantic poetry as well to my name, but it was just purely because I liked the pubs there and the music scene and all that sort of stuff.
What's your doctorate in?
My doctorate is in English literature, and I studied Percy Shelley, the Romantic poet.
This is amazing. I mean, a friend of mine sent me a link today to a video taken by the Parker Solar Probe, the NASA mission, which went into the cornea of the sun and documented its journey. The first time we've sent anything into the sun, outer envelope of the sun. And I started thinking about Robert Heinlein's The Golden Apples of the Sun. And the Golden Apples of the Sun is a line from Shelley. And so I dug out the story and I sent it off to him today. And I was reading, I was reading some Shelley today and everything. So speaking of romantic poetry, I'm an English major too, by the way.
Right. Well, there you go.
No doctorate though.
Well, don't worry. I won't lord it over you with my.
Just try, pal. Just try.
If anybody says in a plane, is there a doctor on the plane? Is there a doctor? I don't swan up with my grasp of literary theory.
Yeah, right.
Not particularly good grasp of literary theory, it has to be said.
Well, it was all those pubs that you keep on talking about.
Oh my God, yeah. The pub was there were two pubs. One was called the Oxford and the other was called the Cambridge. So, I always like to think I did spend a lot of time in Oxford and Cambridge, just not the not the actual right ones.
Nice.
Listen, congratulations on the book, Space Odyssey. I've got my copy here, my well-read copy.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, 2001: A Space Odyssey for me personally is probably definitely one of my top 3, maybe top 2 films. It's sort of, and whether it's number 1 at any given point often depends on which film I'm watching.
What are the others?
Well, I think Casablanca is right. Is one of the top 2/3, and maybe The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Great. Love both of them. Yeah.
I mean, it's. I think of them in the way. I'm not sure. I think people formulate this question a little bit differently, but if I had 3 hours left to live, and someone said you've got one last film to watch, what do you want to watch? I think it would be one of those 3.
That's interesting. So if you had 3 hours left to live, you would actually spend some of it. You would spend a chunk of it watching a film. That speaks highly of you, sir.
Yeah, I mean, what else is there to do? Well, what else is there to do that slots into that time anyway?
Yeah, well, I don't know, man. That's an interesting way of looking at things, and certainly. I don't actually need to see 2001 again. I can play it in my head. I've seen it so many times. And, having written the book about it, I know what was going on behind the camera. You can see what's going on in front of the camera. So I like to think I have a kind of 360-degree view, at least to the extent that was possible with archival research I could do and the people I could speak to who are still alive,
What was your first experience of the film, though? When did you first come across it?
I get into that a bit in the foreword, the first chapter actually of the book. I was 6 years old, and my mom was a science fiction fan and took me to see it. And at age 6, my God, you're rather open to everything, and it completely blew me away. And I will always remember following her down the sidewalk in the bright sun afterwards, because it was a matinee screening, asking her, "What did it mean? But what did it mean?" And as I say in my opening chapter, to her credit, she answered, I don't know. I don't know, rather than saying something reassuring or I don't know. So then I saw it many times after that, but it really did kind of impact, in a sense, impacted my life's trajectory because, I do work well outside of cultural histories or what have you, or I've been producing, for example, planetary landscapes using raw data from NASA missions and staging large touring exhibitions of that kind of content. I probably wouldn't have been doing that if I hadn't been made aware at age 6 that the content coming from our deep space missions may just as well be understood as being a chapter in the history of art as of science. 2001 made that kind of stuff implicitly clear, that kind of idea.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, I think I was similarly young, maybe not quite that young, but I remember watching it on BBC Two, and I think it showed over Christmas. It was one of the big films that we're going to show during the Christmas week or 2 weeks of great TV that traditionally that's one of those British traditions. We have great TV at Christmas, apparently.
Unfortunately, though, the best way to see it first time is, of course, on a huge screen. But not to cast any aspersions on your experience. Tell me about your feeling when you first saw it, and how old were you?
Well, it wasn't. It will have been about 8 or 9. It were probably not as young as 6. And I remember, I think there were 2 viewings. I remember watching it first with my mum and dad, my family, and us all sitting down to watch this big science fiction film, and of course expecting Star Wars, and then as happens in many a Christmas sort of family viewing, people drifting off as it went on and on and on, and it seemed endless. And I have this memory of myself, although this might be self-aggrandizing, of sort of sitting there and insisting, come on, this is really good, this is really. And then I watched it about 2 years later when I was a little bit older and a bit more, and being really blown away by it, but already primed to watch it, because I thought, this is this difficult film that nobody else seems to get, and so I'm going to get it. And we were at my uncle's house, my auntie and my uncle's, and it was like a family thing. And I'd already said to everyone, look, this film is on at this, this is before video recorders and stuff. This film is on at this time. I have to have the television. So everybody was else, well, we're fine. We're all having a meal anyway, so it doesn't matter. So I went off into this little room and watched it on my own, and again was sort of knocked out by it. And from then on, it was the first video I ever bought. But I only recently saw it on the big screen. I saw it on the big screen in Cannes when it was introduced by Christopher Nolan, among others. I think Christiana Kubrick was there as well. So yeah, I mean, so it's been the film, after sort of I forced my family out of the room so I could watch this sort of masterpiece. It became a sort of artifact for me, almost, that it was this magical sort of. It wasn't just a film. It was cinema itself. It was all of cinema, which I think I'm stealing. That sounds like somebody else said that.
It's like music, right? You're influenced by everything. Let me say this. You said earlier that this hard to understand, difficult, complicated film was ... That difficult to understand, complicated film was the highest grossing film of 1968. It's the only time Stanley Kubrick ever achieved that. It also altered the course of Hollywood. It marked the switch from the Western. It marked the switch from the Western to big budget science fiction as the Hollywood, main vehicle of big budget production. So despite the risks it took, the nonverbal nature of it, the lack of explanation to the audience of what was going on, the necessity that audiences pay attention with their eyes, as Kubrick put it in 68 in an interview. Despite all that, it became a huge success, which was not reflected in the Oscars early the next year, but certainly was reflected in the history of film. So your gut instinct there about how it's cinema itself, I think, was borne out. And that's not necessarily always the case. The commercial success obviously signifies artistic and critical success, but in this case, it did.
And yeah, it seems such a kind of unlikely film, because the Kubrick has had a successful career up until that point. He's made significant films. He's definitely, but I mean, it's not like he's made Avatar or some huge commercial success which has allowed him this the sort of, well, not exactly the blank check that he gets, but he certainly seems to get a lot of artistic freedom, considering how big the project sort of becomes.
Well, there are 2 reasons for that. Spartacus, which got multiple Oscars, and Strangelove, huge critical success, and also financial, commercial. So I actually have a different opinion than what you just expressed. He really had proved himself with the big budget mega production with Spartacus, and then he proved himself critically multiple times. Also Paths of Glory. So that's why OBrien, whose his first name is going to occur, Robert O'Brien, of course. Robert O'Brien, president and CEO of MGM. That's why he felt like he could take a bet on Stanley Kubrick. He was a young guy, but he had shown, significant achievements already.
An amazing moxie and sort of self-confidence as well.
Well, I mean, that moxie and self-confidence revealed itself all throughout, but certainly at the end, when there was a lot of pressure, I think, that Kubrick was putting on himself, and certainly the studio was putting on him, to make the film more understandable to your average Joe, which resulted in Stanley asking Arthur Clarke, who he collaborated with throughout, to write voiceover narration blocks of text for voiceover narration for the film to explain what was going on to the audience. And Clarke was doing that up until December 1967. And then finally, Stanley had the courage of his convictions, or whatever cliche you want to use. I mean, he realized, no, this is a nonverbal experience and it should be that. And yanked it. They never recorded them, by the way. And Arthur was very upset. And so Stanley Kubrick was brave enough to have spent all that money, MGM money, taken 4 years to make the thing, to launch it with no explanation whatsoever beyond the dawn of man title card and, Jupiter 6 months later and so on, with no title card in that radical jump between prehistory and the near future, the year 2001, with the bone and the match cut, which people mistakenly describe as a jump cut. It's a match cut between the bone and the spacecraft. Match cut, of course, meaning that there's something in the frame at a certain angle, and you find something in the next shot that matches that angle.
I think one of the things that I really enjoyed about your book, and I mean, I sort of have read a lot about 2001 in the past, and I've watched a lot of documentaries and listened to the various sort of commentaries that you get on the DVDs and whatnot. And I've read the Arthur C. Clarke novel and several of the sequels, but it felt like the book would very much sort of set quite a few things to rights. So, for instance, the thing that you said earlier about how much of a commercial success it is, for some reason in my head, I sort of had this myth that it wasn't that big a hit and it didn't do that well. And your book very much puts paid to that idea.
Well, I can explain, though, why you had that feeling, right? It was a disastrous launch. The film, as previewed, or actually as released, to the critics and to initial audiences, was longer than the final cut. Stanley Kubrick didn't see the full film with all the effect sequences cut into it until a week or so before the first preview screenings in, the premiere in Washington, D.C., and then what I call the Kubrick premiere in New York City, because Stanley wasn't at the Washington premiere. He saw it first with an audience in New York. He had no time to evaluate the film as from alpha to omega with all the shots in. His evaluation of it with an audience took place surrounded by the VIP audience and the critics and everything else. So it was no mercy. There were sequences that he had that he cut. I don't remember how many minutes was cut, something like 12, 13. But it was significant material that gave the audience a sense of redundancy and kind of aimlessness. So, for example, I can tell you what shots were cut. Just one of them, for example, was, you might remember the epic shot of the astronaut jogging in the centrifuge right after we see the exterior shot, meaning the shot of the spacecraft on its way to Jupiter 6 months later. And then you see this extraordinary shot of an astronaut running in circles in this centrifuge, and the camera follows him up and over and under and around. And it's just, absolute tour de force, achieved with no digital effects, of course, because they didn't exist at the time. And that's fantastic stuff. But then Stanley made the mistake of including almost the same shot with the other astronaut, Keir Delay. So the first one was Gary Lockwood. And then, that's where the audience basically started muttering to itself, and they were even booing and hissing. I've heard this from a person who was there, and I wrote about it in the book, of course. So there was material in there that just kind of remove that suspension of disbelief that you need to proceed in a film. And so he cut that, and then it became the most successful. So, but all the critics were merciless. I mean, not all of them. There was a good review in the New Yorker. There was a very, very good review in the Boston Globe. But the other critics were pretty merciless, even savage, even putting down Stanley Kubrick, personally. And so that's probably why you had that perception.
I mean, did the critics went after him because they sort of also saw that there was this sort of grand sort of pretension in the movie as well, maybe?
I don't see pretension in that film, although, it's interesting. I just wrote an essay for a Library of America volume about Mad Magazine that's coming out next year. And it was about my experience as a kid reading Mad Magazine in the early 70s in Ankara, Turkey. We lived there because my father was a diplomat. And I remember the Mad parody of 2001, which is, really, it's one of the good ones, with the man apes bounding around the monolith. And, at first they don't know if they're on in the set of Planet of the Apes or 2001 and so forth. So obviously there's stuff there that's ripe for parody. But I don't find it to be a pretentious film in any way.
No, that's not my valuation either. But I mean, there's certainly an ambition there, and there's from the very first notes of the Richard Strauss music that you have at the beginning. There's a grandeur and an unironic sort of sense of the epic, which I can see people I can see certain critics sort of having a problem with.
Well, incidentally, that music first plays over what people haven't necessarily grasped is a lunar eclipse, because what you see is the dark side of the moon, the night side of the moon, and the camera rises and you see Earth rising over the lunar horizon. This is 68, the same year that was first seen by Apollo astronauts. The Apollo 8 crew saw it months later. That epic, scene. Yeah. But beyond the Earth is the sun rising. And so you have a cosmic alignment of the kind that humanity has found mystical and powerful and disquieting and so forth and epic since before recorded history. So, and then later in the film, you have these alignments during key moments of the story. So, yeah, it's not ironic. It's not, it's not skeptical. It's kind of trying to present the grandeur of the cosmos using 65 millimeter negative projected on 70 millimeter film, as big and clean and rich as possible with that technology of the 60s.
What I love as well, though, is you have, on the one hand, you have this huge sort of film that we receive that is done, that is is a masterpiece right from the get-go, at least in my book. And then in your book, in the stories, there's this sense of real gradually finding the film, that the film is not a sort of eureka moment, and there are so many different versions of almost every, like when you see the monolith, you think, oh, of course it's a monolith, of course it's black, that makes perfect sense. And then of course, no, it took a long time to get there.
Yeah. I mean, one reason I wanted to write this book is, I was a filmmaker. I'm not really in that game anymore, but I was enough of a filmmaker to understand that behind every production there is a struggle to get it made, every production, and sometimes an epic struggle, and many stories and many individuals, and and the auteur theory. I have some sympathy for the auteur theory, and certainly in the case of Stanley Kubrick, I mean, the film would not be what it is, and if he hadn't exercised control, kind of benevolent despot control over every aspect. But Kubrick, I've compared him to Miles Davis. Miles Davis also had complete control over his music, but he knew how to let his people, who were the best, play and solo and improvise, jazz being a music of improvisation. And Stanley likewise knew how to find the right people who could put up with his, exceedingly detail-oriented personality, his fanaticism, really, but never a cruel, well, he could be cruel later in life, especially, but usually it was always at the service of the film, Anyway, I guess my point is that he knew how to work with people. He knew how to deploy various talents. He knew how to listen. He took the best material, the best ideas of Arthur Clarke, for example, who the book presents very much as a co-author, and rightfully so, of 2001, because 2001 was solidly grounded on Arthur Clarke's decades of work devising his own way of speaking about the cosmos in his novels. And not just his novels, but also his nonfiction. He was one of the leading advocates for space exploration well before Sputnik in nonfiction essays and so on. He wrote an essay, actually a scientific paper in 1945 proposing geostationary orbit as a perfect place to put satellites for communications. He was quite a formidable character. Of the two principals, he's the one I got to know, by the way. I never had the chance to talk to Stanley, but I got to know Arthur. I spent quite a bit of time with him. I visited him in Sri Lanka 3 times. And in fact, he wrote the foreword to my first book. So
probably came to 2001 more from the angle of Arthur C. Clarke. I read his book, Lost Worlds of 2001 as well.
Good one. Yeah.
Yeah, really, really interesting insight into it, as well as a lot of his other fiction. So then after 2001, I start watching other Kubrick movies, and then it's like, oh, okay, who's this guy?
Right. In the sense also that Stanley had a kind of a cold and knowing and even sardonic way of looking at the world. You see that in Paths of Glory. You see that certainly you see that in Clockwork Orange and Strangelove. You see it all across his work. Arthur brought a kind of utopian positivity to that equation, and I've compared it to Lennon and McCartney, where, the classic story is McCartney comes into the studio with lyrics. It's getting better all the time. Everything's getting better. It's just better. It's getting better. And then Lennon added, it couldn't get much worse. Right. And so that's your classic late 60s collaboration, and so was Stanley and Arthur. And speaking of Lennon and McCartney, I imagine I don't want to get too far off topic here, but I've been watching the new Peter Jackson extraordinary 3-part series, also filmed in 1968, I might add, revealing the dynamics of that collaboration extraordinarily well.
Talking as well about the people involved in the making of the film, of him delegating certain jobs. I thought one of the stories that you brought out really interestingly was that of the actor who plays the main ape in the very first section.
Dan Richter. Yeah,
exactly. Yes.
Dan.
Yeah.
Actually, it's interesting that you mentioned Dan Richter right after I mentioned Lennon and McCartney, because Dan went on to be John Lennon and Yoko Ono's kind of body servant. I don't think he would object to that characterization. He's become a friend right after, and he had a front row seat on the breakup of the Beatles. But Dan Richter is an extraordinary guy, extraordinary character. He came along exactly when Stanley needed him desperately, because it was just not working to stuff people into ape suits and then try to direct them in such a way that they would be understandable, believable, I should say, as proto-humans in Africa. And Dan had been lead mime, I should say, in the American Mime Theater in New York City in the mid-60s, then hit the road, like his entire generation, many people in his generation, was influenced highly by On the Road and other the Beats and the emerging, hippie, let's say, counterculture. And he hit the road, went to Japan, met Yoko, studied no theater, went on a kind of a trip through the world, through Greece, and then ended up in London. A friend of his knew somebody working at Boreham Wood, which is where Stanley was struggling to make 2001. Passed on to Stanley, actually, that he knew of a mime, an American mime, who might have some ideas about ways to realize the man-apes. Stanley asked for a meeting. Dan came in, was one of those people who was not intimidated by Stanley Kubrick, and did a fantastic audition for him where he became a pre-human man-ape. He just incarnated, the language of pre-human primate, extraordinarily well, and got hired. And, I talked about the rest of the story in my book. Dan was also, by the way, a heroin addict, and legally so in the British system. He got his legal dosage of amphetamines and pharmaceutical grade heroin every week or 10 days or something from the UK system. And he performed the extraordinary feat of playing Moonwatcher, which is a name you only read in Arthur's novel, because they don't have names in the film. But he was the lead man ape, the one who threw that bone, which produced the match cut. The leader of his band of man apes, the one who has the insight after experiencing the monolith, has this insight during one of those eclipses or celestial linings up that I described earlier, has this insight that maybe this bone could be used for something other than lying around on the ground and used as a weapon and so forth, first weapon.
And in a way of getting meat as well for their survival.
Yeah, because they were starving and so forth. Yes.
Right. And earlier I mentioned about sort of the lack of irony at the very beginning, but of course there is a great sense of humor that runs through the film. Leonard Rossiter is an amazing comedy actor, and I think he's used very well in the space station. And then you also have the zero gravity toilet, which is one of my favorite shots.
Well, that's the only really overt humor. By the way, before we get off of Dan Richter, though, I want to say that the other key figure behind the believability of those man apes was a man named Stuart Freeborn, who has, his credit was makeup, but it should have been prosthetics, makeup, and wizardry, on the level of some of the great wizards of mythology, because he produced during a lot of pressure from Stanley Kubrick, lots and lots of pressure to improve his game and improve it further. I describe all that in the book, obviously. He got to these skin-tight hair suits, and extraordinary kind of mechanics of the mask in which the person inside could use his tongue. It was all men, young men, to manipulate rubber bands and springs and so forth and magnets and so forth to make the face of these man apes look truly alive. And this was all done way before CGI, way before anything like that. And so Stuart Freeborn also really deserved an Oscar, but they didn't even have Oscars for makeup at that time. Sorry, I'm wrong about that. I think that Planet of the Apes got it for costume, something like that. I'd have to dig around and see if that's really true what I just said. So.
Yeah, I think I remember that the Planet of the Apes won only because I remember Arthur C. Clarke commenting they thought we used real apes.
Yeah. I think that actually it's an interesting comment and it's accurate as far as it goes, but I think that probably the category didn't exist yet. There was visual effects, and Stanley got that, and that's another story. Stanley had a team of people, including Doug Trumbull, who it really should have been the team that got the Oscar, but Stanley got it himself, and Doug Trumbull was very upset about that. Doug Trumbull, who did visual effects, one of the team that did visual effects, and came up with so-called Stargate sequence, this vaulting forward in space and time effect produced in that sequence after the Discovery spacecraft reaches Jupiter. There's this epic trip through space and time that the sole surviving astronaut goes through, the Odysseus astronaut, let's say, Bowman.
Let's put a pin in that and come to it later. So it's because it's a lovely it's a mini film in itself, that whole sequence.
Definitely.
Just to stick for a second, sort of almost chronologically with the film. The other thing that I remember learning from your book was the fact that they sort of send a team to Africa to film for the front projection. That's such an amazing story.
Yeah. So actually, it wasn't even filming. It was all stills. And the stills were meant for this front projection technique. That's true. Basically, what happened was Stanley had been considering for a while the possibility of bringing a crew there and trying to film there, but it was just way too hot, to film there. And so he sent Andrew Birkin, Jane Birkin's brother, who was a young assistant of his, and a crew, including a photographer, well-known French photographer and so on, to document desert landscapes. And then I tell the story. I tell the story about those distinctive trees, which were protected under South African law. I mean, South Africa then controlled Namibia. It was the Namib Desert, the kokerbon trees. And Stanley said, "I want those trees, in that landscape." And Andrew said, "Well, they don't grow there. They grow elsewhere, and they're protected." And Stanley said, "Well, I have faith in you." So Andrew organized a little raiding party. They had to cut through a wire fence. They broke the law to uproot these protected trees, take them across the desert in 2 big trucks at night. There was a incident where the trees in one of the 2 trucks caught fire. Just extraordinary stuff happened. Then finally they ended up with a few of the trees, and you can see them. You can indeed see a couple tiny little trees they're small in the frame, in the front projection backdrops. I won't explain front projection backdrops here. It'll take too many words, but in any case, you can see them. But when you see them larger, they were recreations of the trees made in England at MGM Studios. But that whole story, when Andrew told me that story, I have to say, that's when I knew, it's one of the times when I knew that it was really a good decision to write this book and take the time to do it, because I knew that there would be a lot of interesting stories about how they made that film. I wanted to look under the hood, and indeed I did, that plus, for example, Bill Weston and the stunts and his story of doing stunts for the film. Both of those stories I'm very proud of having excavated and written about, because I do believe, I have to say, that this film will be studied for hundreds of years, maybe even longer, and that material excavated now, for example, we don't know what Shakespeare was thinking when he wrote his plays. We just have the plays themselves. I'm hoping that some of these stories will go down through time, and they will be known as backdrop to what produced this masterpiece. Because I do think that they will. And in one reason, though, they will be studying it in 500 years, or one reason it will still have power in 500 years, is that there's not a lot of dialogue in some ancient language that we don't really understand anymore. It's all so visual. It's just pure visual storytelling.
Well, you have that first African sequence, the Dawn of Man sequence, and then you have the sequence of the trip via the space station to the moon. And pretty much all of that, except for the very short sort of dialogue in the space station, is nonverbal. It's the music of Strauss. And it's the visuals.
Exactly. Incidentally, involving the music of Strauss, the waltz music, and then the waltzing space station. There's another interesting kind of confluence of things there. One is that Vienna has a Ferris wheel, which is quite well known. It was in The Third Man. It's not as famous as the London Eye, but it's pretty famous in Central Europe, and Orson Welles was filmed in it and all that. And, if you go to Vienna to this day, if you went there right now, okay, Austria is closed down because of this stupid virus, but if it was running, you would be hearing waltz music being played while it turns, because that's what they do in Vienna, And Stanley took his bride to Vienna, Christiane, on their kind of proto-honeymoon, and they had a great weekend in Vienna when they were filming in Munich for Paths of Glory. And they went on the Ferris wheel, Now, who knows? Who knows to what extent that permeated his consciousness overtly when he chose to use Strauss for the space station turning. But it was probably there subconsciously. And the other point I would make about that wheel-shaped space station, it came from the Wernher von Braun spaceflight vocabulary developed with Disney in the 50s. But Wernher von Braun never gave credit for that elegant wheel-shaped space station to its actual originator, who was an Austro-Hungarian scientist named Herman Potočnik Nordum, who was actually Slovenian ethnically, was born in Pula in what's now Croatia, and made a beautiful design in the late 20s of exactly that kind of, artificial gravity producing wheel-shaped space station. So again, Vienna being the capital of one of the 2 capitals of the Habsburg Empire.
And then when you get to the moon, you have this amazing, there's this what was it? A briefing scene, really, which is Which I have to. I mean, I wrote an article a couple of years ago about the dialogue in 2001 in my sort of like. I'm kind of interested in it because there's so little of it.
Yeah, it must have been I was going to say it must have been a short article.
Yeah, but I kind of like that. I really think the dialogue is amazingly done, because it has this.
Yes. Well, go ahead. It has this.
Well, I was going to say it has this sort of dryness in that there's a real dry sense of humor. The mission sort of briefing is very official speak and officialese, and it's very robotic. And then when they're more informal in the shuttle that's going to visit the monolith site, and they're talking about what sandwiches they're going to have, it's so sort of banal, and I can't. I don't think that's bad dialogue. I think that's really well written dialogue, because I think it's making these characters into just bureaucrats essentially, rather than adventurers.
So true. And some of the incorrect criticism in 2001 and 68 was that the actors were too robotic and so forth, and that's entirely missing the point Stanley was making. By the way, I keep on calling him Stanley like I've met him, but I feel like I know him having written this book. Of course, if I met him, I'd say, Mr. Kubrick, it's such an honor. In the late 60s, it was totally clear that the most robotic, meaning efficient, human beings were being sent to space. Neil Armstrong, who landed on the moon, had such a cool head that he managed to avoid what would have been certain death for almost anybody else in a Gemini mission in orbit of the Earth. I think it was 66, when the spacecraft started spinning wildly out of control to the point where they were going unconscious. And he had the presence of mind to figure out how to reverse it. He figured it out despite the fact that they were spinning like that. And these are not people who you rely on for poetic descriptions of Earthrise. These are people who you rely on to get there and get back alive. And Stanley was riffing on all that. And he also, has to be said, was presenting this extraordinary contrast between HAL, the supercomputer, and Discovery, and the astronauts. And there was an implicit sense that the humanity had, in some senses, been drained from the astronauts, if you equate humanity with emotionalism of a certain kind. And that certainly that a type of humanity, or certainly sentience, had been inserted into this mainframe computer with the red eye. Cyclops eye. And the last thing I'll say there about that is that, we were talking about how the dialogue is very banal. The dialogue is very, deracinated. The one place in the film where the dialogue is utterly powerful and critical is the most powerful single scene in the film, which is when Bowman is deprogramming Hal, and Hal is pleading for his life. Now that is reliant on words. And even though there aren't that many words, it's just one of those extraordinary sequences. When I was 6 years old, I was completely riveted and horrified. It was just horror, right? At that age, I was intelligent enough to understand what was going on at age 6. That this was a creature, a being begging for its life, having committed various crimes. That was clear. And a merciless human being doing what it had to do, what he had to do.
Yeah, the line, my mind is going, I can feel it, Frank. I can feel it. It's that I can feel it it's almost, I think it's the only entity in the entire film who kind of admits to feelings.
Yeah, it's so true. So true, so true. My mind is going, and it's also a classic 60s, 1968 line, to go back to the Beatles, John Lennon was asked about 2001, and he said, 2001? I see it every week. So there was that drug culture thing, which I don't think was conscious. I don't think it was conscious on the part of either Stanley or Arthur Clarke to put that in there. It was just it was an artifact of the times, as was the Star Child at the end.
Right. It was a sense of like the stars aligning in terms of the science fiction culture and the drug culture sort of merging or overlapping at a certain point.
Yeah, and the post-war rise of computing power after the Enigma machine and, British intelligence deploying, the best minds of its generation to work on decoding German coded signals and so on, which produced computing, proto-computing power that ended up, even by the late 60s, there was enough computing power so that we could send somebody to the moon, even though it seems ridiculously small now. We needed it to go to the moon.
When you get that cut as well to the Jupiter mission, I think that's also one of my favorite pieces of music in the film is the Russian ballet suite that you get coming in as you see the long tracking shot of Discovery going across the screen. That whole sequence, also in terms of your book and the making of the film, is where you have a lot of those, let's say, those bigger special effects shots happening, like the construction of the centrifuge to create that sense of a zero gravity, well, it's not really zero gravity, but it's gravity in 360 degrees.
It's artificial gravity. Yeah. I mean, the centrifuge set was extraordinarily expensive. It took a big percentage of the budget. I don't remember what the percentage is right now. It's in my book. Or at least an estimate. It was built by Vickers Armstrong, which is the aerospace company that had produced the Spitfire, iconic World War II Spitfire fighter aircraft. And, it was the size of, it was 3 stories high, something like that, in a big soundstage in Bourne Wood. It rotated on a, central pivot point or whatever you call it, a hub. That's the word. And, and the astronaut was always the actor playing the astronaut was always at the bottom because it had to be filmed in one Earth gravity, unfortunately. But the cameras would then go around and the cinematographer and the focus puller, would be on this kind of rickety chair going round and round. It was quite hazardous. There was one escape hatch and a lot of film lights and a lot of flammable materials. And it was just one of those classic examples of pushing things to the edge in film production.
Yeah, oh my God, they'd have a job making it today with the sort of safety standards and what have you. Probably rightly so.
Yeah, probably rightly so. But luckily, they have all the visual effects. They have digital effects and all that. So
yeah, it wouldn't be necessary perhaps. And then one of the things that I watched this film most recently, I was lucky enough to see the screening at Cannes when they showed it, a new sort of print, and it was on the big screen at the Debussy Theatre. Christopher Nolan introduced it, and I remember it was amazing, and it was the first time I'd seen it on the big screen, and it was the first time I'd seen it with the with the overture and everything, and several observations that the hundreds of times I'd seen the film previously, I hadn't to that extent noticed. One was the how amazing the soundtrack is. Not the score, but the soundtrack. The sound of the breathing, the sound of the hissing of the spacecraft, and how in that sequence where Bowman is locked outside, how it's almost like a Hitchcock sequence, that sequence.
Yeah, and by the way, speaking of sound, and another example of Kubrick's fearlessness, when the shots cut to space, there is zero sound. Zero sound. An exterior shot, let's say, of Discovery and the space pod. Zero sound on the soundtrack, nothing. That never happens anymore. And it almost never happened before, and up until Silence, or back to silent movies, of course. And then you had a piano player or something. Because, in a vacuum, there's no sound. Your ears will not hear anything, and so forth. And Stanley took that quite literally and didn't add a backdrop of ventilations or beeps or any of that stuff. So I don't know if you remember this, but when Hal murders one of the two astronauts by using one of the space pods to clip his oxygen line, and he's seen spinning off and struggling and trying to reattach the line. That's in utter silence for part of the sequence. You only hear interior sounds of the spacecraft when the shot cuts to Bowman at the controls in Discovery, So the horror is somehow compounded by the silence. And in that sense, I suppose it's got a Hitchcock element, yeah.
I remember as well the scene where Bowman sort of blows the explosive bolts, which have been brilliantly sort of foreshadowed by you seeing the words "danger, explosive bolts" on a couple of occasions earlier. And the sound comes in only when the chamber fills with air.
Right. Brilliant. That's exactly how it would be, actually, if you manage to survive that type of re-entry to some kind of oxygenated environment. Yeah.
Going to the something we mentioned earlier that I'd like to just get your thoughts on. That Stargate C sequence it's one of the parts of the film I've seen the most often, because when I had it on my video cassette, that was the bit that I would play again and again and again, just separate from the film almost, and marvel at how it was done, and never really understand how it was done.
Well, it was done in multiple different kinds of ways and using different techniques. And I have to say, I love Doug Trumbull, and I know him, and I've known him for quite a few years now. And I'm a big admirer of his. And he had reason to be upset when the Oscar went only to Stanley. But to look at it from Stanley's viewpoint, a section or one type of shot done in that Stargate sequence was indeed conceived of and executed by Stanley in New York City before they even moved to the UK to film. And that involved tanks of liquids and then dyes and inks deployed, dropped into the black liquid, which would produce, when shot and at high speed, producing slow motion, and with bright lights necessary because of the high shutter speed, looked like nebulae in deep space. And that was based on work done for a black and white Canadian film called Universe, supervised by Wally Gentleman, who had worked in the first part of 2001 and then quit because he was just tired of working with Stanley. It was based on that kind of breakthrough in how to produce deep space images that look the way it was decades later that the Hubble Space Telescope showed us what that looked like with complete clarity and in color, in the 90s. But prior to that, we had grainy shots from Earth, from the big observatories of nebulae in color, but they were very grainy. So Stanley conceived of that based on the Canadian film, which was black and white, and shot it and was breathing toxic fumes for week after week. I heard this from Christian. He would come home with his eyes red, from breathing all these noxious fumes from the solvents used and so on. He would show up at dawn, having worked all night on those sequences. So he put a lot of blood and sweat into visual effects himself, and so that probably, to his mind at least, justified him accepting the Oscar. On the other hand, Doug made the point that he could have stated to the Academy, wait a sec, this was a team effort and these people deserve it as well. And the Academy most likely would have listened.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that sequence as well is really seems to push the film to what the film has already been doing, which is, as you were saying, sort of visual storytelling for the most part. And it pushes it to the absolute limit, where you're going into levels of abstraction. You recognize that we're on some sort of journey, we're going towards something, but story kind of breaks down into a form of visual poetry.
Absolutely. And, Doug gives Stanley credit where credit is due, in the sense that Doug said to me that, one thing you don't get in that sequence is, okay, at the very end, you get some reaction shots of the astronaut absolutely having a kind of a nervous breakdown. Freeze frame shots of his eyeball and so on. Very stylized at the end. But in general, throughout the sequence, you don't have cutaways to the space pod in that environment. The audience goes on that trip. It's the audience's point of view. It's Bowman's point of view implicitly. In any case, the sense of subjectivity of the spacecraft, or if I can put it that way, or the character is tossed in favor of the experience of the audience. The audience is given the experience. So that was also a brilliant breakthrough, I would say, in the language of commercial cinema. I mean, experiments were being done in the 60s. All kinds of interesting stuff was being done in the 60s and low budget films. There was some criticism also from Pauline Kael, that Kubrick and his people were ripping off experimental filmmakers and so on. I don't really buy that. Let a million flowers bloom and so on. Everybody influences everybody else. I don't think there was overt ripping off of anybody there. Can I say one more thing, just to rewind a bit, a moment to my describing the astronaut spinning off into space and struggling to put his oxygen line back on. So another unsung hero of 2001 who I was delighted to bring to the fore in my book is a guy named Bill Weston, who was the stuntman who was up there on thin cables hanging 3 stories above a hard concrete floor at Boreham Wood in 66 and 67 when they shot those sequences, spinning on a single wire with the camera directly below him so that if the wire snapped, he would be impaled on the camera, and doing so in conditions that would certainly have resulted in the film, the shooting of the film being halted. And these days, Stanley never could have gotten away with it because Weston came to Stanley and said, hey, I'm not getting enough air up there, and I need you. I want to punch some holes in the helmet so I can breathe better. And Stanley refused. And he was given a little bottle of oxygen, which lasted for about 12 minutes, and didn't even have there was no way to get the carbon dioxide that Bill was exhaling out of the helmet. And so Weston was hanging upside down or sideways, way above this concrete floor, with oxygen feeding in for only 12 minutes during sequences that sometimes required 20 minutes or half an hour. He would lose the oxygen while they were setting up and then be without oxygen, and he passed out numerous times. I tell the story in the book of that one time when he passed out and he came to and he went off looking for Stanley because he was going to give him a real beating. and Stanley fled the studio and wasn't seen for 3 days, and then through intermediaries offered Bill the best dressing room and beer in the fridge and all kinds of stuff. And I should say Weston had been a mercenary in South Africa and was a guy who you didn't want him coming after you with the intention of beating you up. You certainly didn't want that. So, but Weston, having said all that, there's a great quote in my book where Weston says, and then he by the way, he then continued working. He did a bunch of Bond films. He did all kinds of stuff. And in the end, when he was being interviewed much, much, much later by Dave Larson, who's a guy who I worked with, who I admire greatly, who has been researching 2001 for half of his life, gave me access to some of the interviews he made, including with Bill Weston. Weston said to Dave, in the end, the film he was proudest of was 2001. After all that.
I mean, that's the thing is, I think it's the one Stanley Kubrick film where everything is on the screen. All that perfection, all that mania, all that obsession, it's really on the screen. I mean, Barry Lyndon, you could say, well, it's beautiful and all the rest of it, but it doesn't need to necessarily have gone to such extremes to get that. Whereas in 2001, you think there's no real other way of making that movie.
I agree. Certainly with the technology that they had then. And of course, they invented a lot of it. I mean, they developed it from the ground up. I mean, it was an R&D project. 2001 was a research and development project funded by MGM. 2001 involved what contemporary film producers would definitely consider unnecessary amounts of research. Pilgrimages to MIT to talk to Marvin Minsky about artificial intelligence, consulting with IBM and Bell Labs about flat screen technologies and what would a spacecraft look like in the year 2001. What do you think? Give us your best guess, best idea. And then the best people in the field did that in exchange for some product placement, They were really, hard science fiction is a genre characterized by its adherence to what we really know. And Arthur Clarke and Isaac Asimov and Robert Heinlein, but especially Asimov and Clarke, were the epitome of hard science fiction. It had to be something true to what physics could allow, according to our, the understanding of the time. And so that technique was used and deployed. That was the kind of thing Stanley understood intuitively because he was that kind of geek himself. So he and Arthur did extensive research, deployed various, other people to do it for them as well, and so on. So you see that in every frame, I mean, those flat screens, for example, if you compare 2001's flat screens to Alien, which was shot a decade later, which had CRT monitors and Nostromo, you see the difference of approach between those two films right there. Because 2001 looks more futuristic to this day than Nostromo. I love Alien, don't get me wrong, but it was advice from IBM, that you would have flat screens everywhere and that there should be no sign of machinery behind the screens. There would just be flat screens all over the cockpit and so on. And that advice produced that futuristic look. It looks very contemporary now, let's say.
Yeah, I mean, you even have like an iPad, which is
yes,
stunning.
Yes, and by the way, another little thing that I uncovered, which had me shaking my head, is that one of the things that was supposed to be on that iPad-like device, which had IBM on it, incidentally, and which was mounted permanently to the table that it seemed to be just dropped on top of, and below the table was a 16-millimeter projector, two different 16-millimeter projectors projecting content onto the ground glass of that seemingly just casually placed on the table iPad-like device. One of what you see in the film is a BBC interview with the astronauts, right? But there's another form of content that they worked up, and that was with permission from the New York Times, and that was an online newspaper. And if that had been used, and it was the New York Times, so if that had been used just for one shot for just 5 seconds, we would be saying today that 2001, the internet was invented by Stanley Kubrick and his team,
Amazing. That's amazing. And I mean, that level of detail, level of work, you can kind of see in the way, I mean, you mentioned Alien afterwards as well, but 2001 really just stands out like a colossus. There's nothing beforehand that looks anything like it. And then even afterwards, I watched it on the big screen a couple of years back, and it stands up better than something like Avatar will stand up, or the Star Wars prequels, which I know it's a different genre and everything, but in terms of just creating convincing, versions of space.
I wouldn't say that's a different genre, even Star Wars. I mean, those films would not have been possible. Avatar and that whole genre was the origin of that genre, as I said earlier, was 2001: Space Odyssey and its commercial success in 1968. And to the credit of all those directors, I mean, Cameron, Lucas, you name it, Spielberg, they all acknowledge. So, Alien director,
Really?
yeah, Scott. They all acknowledge that Kubrick is just the master. I mean, they've all been trying. Christopher Nolan, they've all been trying to come up with something as extraordinary as 2001. And that's great, because that means that there's a lot of very interesting big budget sci-fi out there. I can't say that I've been particularly convinced that any of it is as great as 2001, but of course I saw it at age 6 and it blew my mind and it changed my life. So I'm not exactly, I'm kind of not, I don't have any, objectivity in that regard, as my 20-year-old son would point out, who loves Christopher Nolan.
Right. Well, yeah, we all do. But I mean, even outside of that science fiction, I watch films, art house films, which I see have massive influences from Kubrick. Whether it's Terrence Malick to Gaspar Noé to Yorgos Lanthimos, who made The Favourite, but his sort of earlier films are very have a real Kubrick sheen to them, should I say.
By the way, I worked on Tree of Life, and I'm in the credits of Tree of Life. I supervised some visual effects sequences in Tree of Life, and I met Doug Trumbull. I met Doug Trumbull through that production, just to give a sense of how my life trajectory, has been impacted by having seen 2001 at age 6. And absolutely, you're right. By the way, I would say something else though about science fiction. The science fiction film genre and the 60s. Even before 2001, there were masterpieces of sci-fi being produced that are comparable in their, let's say, artistic integrity. I'm referring to Alphaville by Godard. I'm referring to, what's the fantastic film, which is all stills, except for one moving shot.
Oh, Sans Soleil.
No, not Sans Soleil. That's Chris Marker, but it is Chris Marker, and it's it's La Jetée. Yeah, so both La Jetée and Alphaville are low budget, very low budget French sci-fi movies. Both of them predate Kubrick, and they took a different route to sci-fi glory, let's say. They're both dystopian meditations on this dystopian future in which a supercomputer, in the case of Alphaville, is controlling human destiny, But they didn't even try to have visual effects comparable to, of course, they couldn't be comparable to 2001. It hadn't been made yet. It's just a different approach.
Having sort of, as you say, you don't need to see 2001 anymore because it's in your head, you having worked on it so much. What was the biggest thing that through that sort of incredible close attention and through that archival work that you've done, what was the thing that perhaps changed your opinion most in terms of either Kubrick or the film itself?
See if I can think of one thing. It was just a kind of a accretion of multiple stories, an accretion of many, many stories, informing me about the thinking behind 2001, the logic behind it, the ideas behind it, the techniques required to make it. I don't know if there's, we've covered a number of those stories today, So I can't really isolate one thing. There are a couple more stories I would tell you, though. So one of them concerns, we were talking about the, dawn of man, we were talking about the Stargate sequence, the trip sequence between the arrival at Jupiter and then the resurrection of the astronaut and so on. One component of that Stargate sequence, you had the liquids in suspension aspect with the nebulae blooming in deep space. Then you have the slit scan material of these extraordinary landscapes zooming at the viewer, sometimes with shapes floating above, which really has a connection to abstract art and so forth. But then you also have these kind of color inverted landscape shots from aerial from helicopters or airplanes, which, might look, it's the one part of the sequence that might look a little bit dated today, although I still like it. And I think that the film just holds up. But one type of that shot, a lot of it was shot by Birkin in a helicopter over Scotland, over northern Scotland. And that's a lot of what you see. And then they did all the kinds of, stuff to the footage at MGM. But another story, which I learned, it was about Robert Gaffney, a cinematographer who had worked with Kubrick on Dr. Strangelove and who was tasked by Kubrick from London with getting shots of Arizona, Monument Valley from a plane for that same sequence. And he, did so, but almost lost his life because he took off in a Cessna, a little single-engine plane at sunrise, this being dawn of man. Oh, no, sorry. It's not the dawn of man. Excuse me, I'm getting confused. He took off at sunrise because that's the best time. That and sunset are the best times to shoot. That was exactly when this updraft came whooshing across the desert in Arizona and shooting up this ridge, that he had to fly over in order to shoot the Monument Valley object. And the plane spun up out of control and they almost died, So that's just another example of near-death experience, Bill Weston being another, in the making of the film, pushing the edge, pushing everything to the very edge of possibility. I don't know if it's not a single story reveal, that changed my entire view of the film. That's hard to come up with.
I guess what I meant is sort of, does... especially in terms of Kubrick's personality, do you find that after, spending so long with the man and going through all these stories, does your admiration grow, or do you feel more ambivalent because of the sacrifices that he sort of forced on other people and the way other people might have been put at risk, for instance? Or how do you feel?
Yeah, that's a very different question. And my admiration only grew. I have to say, I benefited greatly from getting to know Christiane Kubrick, his widow. And she trusted me and told me all kinds of very intimate stories, including about his near nervous breakdown on the night of the premiere in New York. She also told me that he would come back from the studio, from long, long, long days at the studio, gripped by vast self-doubt and, confessing to her that he didn't have the slightest idea of what he was going to do and how he was going to bring the film off, and that he was overwhelmed, and it was a mess, and it wasn't going to work, and so on. And he would say things like, "How could I have criticized so and so and so and so other directors? I'm not even nearly as good as they are." And then he would say, she would say to him, Stanley, hey, you're tired? Make yourself, let's get you a hamburger, and you're doing great work, and so on. So and also another thing I'd say about Kubrick, he could be cruel. Earlier I said, that happened in later films. I mean, he could be cruel to some, if actors didn't remember their lines, woe betide those actors. They would be the subject of Stanley's wrath and sometimes hazing. But in general, he was the first guy there and the last to leave. He was not somebody who issued instructions from afar, and those who survived and didn't quit because it was too much work or it was too difficult respected him to a person. Doug Trumbull had his differences with Stanley, but Doug had tears in his eyes when he described going to the funeral service for Stanley. And he said, "I loved him, and my life was changed by him," and so forth. There was love for the guy and admiration.
Yeah. It's fascinating to hear those stories of self-doubt as well, because we get so used to the monolith and the monolith, no pun intended, of of that sort of auteur genius that it's sort of refreshing and yet also unsurprising to actually hear those people went home at night and had the same crises that we all have.
Well, certainly Stanley did, but I do have actually a scene that I wanted to maybe quote to you in this podcast, because I just found it so kind of moving and interesting. And the scene it's in my book. Roger Karras and Jeffrey Unsworth, the director of photography, highly experienced director of photography who was shooting the film, went off for lunch at the studio in Borehamwood Wood one day, and Karras told this story. And they were walking, it's a very big studio set up with many buildings, and it was, 10-minute walk, 15-minute walk to the cafeteria. And they're walking there, and Unsworth was uncharacteristically silent. And finally, Roger Karras, who was the vice president of Stanley's two production outfits, one in the U.S. and one in the U.K., said, "Jeffrey, why are you so deeply contemplative?" Unsworth said to Roger Karras, "Do you know, Roger, if anyone had told me 6 months ago that I had anything of any substance to learn about my profession at this stage of the game, I would have told them they were mad. I've been a top British cinematographer, a top man for 25 years, though I have learned..." Okay, so this I quoted this wrong. "A top man for 25 years. In fact, though, I have learned more about my profession from that boy in there in the last 6 months than I have in the previous 25 years. He is an absolute genius. He knows more about the mechanics of optics and the chemistry of photography than anyone who's ever lived. Are you aware of this?"
Wow.
And so, I quoted that. I got it from Karras. There was no other. Those were the only two people there, and Unsworth is dead. And actually, Karras is dead too, but it was from an interview with him. And I got very good reviews for my book, but there were a couple people who said, "Well, there's a bit of hero worship going on here between Benson and Kubrick." And I say that's not the case. I totally deny that, and I have a bunch of material in there that indicates a negative side to the man. But I wanted to put that in there because, yes, you have this auteur theory, and yes, you have, let's say, an industry-wide respect for Kubrick for what he achieved, but it was founded on something. It was founded on actual knowledge. The guy was a photographer for Look magazine before he even got into film. He really knew his stuff. He learned it, The front projection in Dawn of Man was a result of him doing his research himself about what was possible. So anyway, I wanted to tell that story. Maybe I can re-record that section so it doesn't have that bump in the middle later. So you can clip that in.
Sure thing.
See, I have a little bit of that perfectionism in me as well.
There you go. We'll do about 50 takes, I think, before we're really happy with it.
We don't have to do it. We don't have to re-record.
Yes, I want to ask a book recommendation for you, because This podcast is all about recommending and promoting film books and film writers such as yourself. So what book would you recommend to our listeners?
I would recommend a book that totally blew my mind this year. It is not about filmmaking. It's by a Chilean writer named Benjamin Labatut, Labatut. And in English translation, the title is When We Cease to Understand the World. It's an extraordinary fusion of literary nonfiction, which gradually morphs into ever more surreal fiction. And it's about some of the great scientists of the 20th century and how their findings and results had, to put it mildly, double, dialectical implications and two sides to them. And it's, it is like reading a film, by the way. So that in that sense, it's filmic. It's an extraordinarily successful piece of writing. It's not even that long. It just kind of blows you away. I read it in one sitting.
I've read it as well. I read it earlier this year. It's an extraordinary book. And it also it does that thing of making really complicated scientific ideas sort of emotionally present. You feel that this is a version of reality that has something to say about our inner lives as well as how we understand the universe.
Absolutely, absolutely. So in that sense, it also resonates with 2001, I would say. But I'm impressed that you read it. Well done, sir.
No, yeah, I'm. Well, as you can tell from this podcast, I love my books. I love my movies, and I love my books.
Well, thanks so much for reaching out. It was for me a great pleasure to be able to talk about this film. And it's been a while since I did any kind of interview or discussion about 2001. And, it's nice to think about triumphant successes in art and literature at a time when we're looking at another long winter coming up. And, triumphant successes in art and literature are what gets us through dark times, I would say.
I totally agree. That and any victory by Liverpool Football Club are the shining lights. Although other listeners may want to drop in a name of another football club or another sport entirely in that moment. And I think we should congratulate ourselves as well on having an entire conversation about 2001: A Space Odyssey and Stanley Kubrick without once mentioning the moon landing conspiracy theory.
If you want to get into that, we can. I mean, it's so ludicrous. It's just so patently ridiculous that I just, try to bat that one aside. I mean, for example, one of the conspiracy theories seems to be grounded on the fact that Stanley Kubrick shot 2001 the year before the moon landing. But if you look at the aesthetics of the moon in 2001, if you look at the fact that you can see stars in the sky in 2001, that it's jagged topography on the moon in 2001, just the way they shot the moon, it is utterly different from what we saw from the moon. And there are reasons for that. The reasons you don't see stars in the sky in the Apollo footage is that you had bright, glaring sunlight on the surface of the moon during those landings and during the moonwalks and so on. And that was, of course, not accidental. And the only time you're going to see stars from the lunar surface, even though there's no atmosphere, is if you face away from the sun and squint, you might see a few stars. But, it's not just your pupils that would be contracted in that bright sunlight, but also a camera aperture has to be as well. So, and then the whole thing is just ridiculous. I mean, you can point a laser from Earth at those landing sites and you will get a reflection from the little laser reflectors they put on those things. So what are those? I mean, how does that jive with those conspiracies? Not to mention that the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has been orbiting the moon, NASA mission, and has photographed the landing sites. Well, I guess that's also fake. I mean, give me a break.
Can I just ask one further question, actually? What did your shots on Tree of Life, what were those? Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Well, so Terry reached out to me, having seen a number of my books. I have a couple in particular that were relevant to Tree of Life. One of them was looking at the solar system and looking at the history of photography of the solar system and creating large format planetary landscapes from raw interplanetary mission data, image data. And then another was called Far Out, and it was essentially picking up where the first one left off, meaning not the solar system, but everything else. And it was jammed with extremely high quality images from major terrestrial observatories, the Hubble, other space telescopes, etc. And both of those were let's say, edited filmically. I mean, I take illustrated books very seriously as a genre. I don't consider them coffee table books and just, diversions for bourgeois people. They are, especially working with Abrams, which has extremely high production quality, that printed stochastically, for example. I took them seriously as artworks in themselves. And so that resonated with Terry, and he reached out to me and proposed that we collaborate on Tree of Life. We made a deal, an arrangement. I was actually living in Europe at the time, in Slovenia. And, we did a lot of work together. I ended up supervising. I was advising, but I also supervised several sequences. One of them was, for example, to get granular, 2 moons in orbit of Jupiter. And that was all based on material I had raw material image processed and mosaic from the Cassini flyby. When Cassini flew by in the year 2001, I might add, on its way to Saturn, I used that data for that sequence. And by the way, we produced that sequence at Double Negative in London. I was in London. I flew to London to work with Double Negative on that.
Amazing. Wow. Listen, you've been so generous with your time, Michael, and I really appreciate it. I really appreciate this conversation. I absolutely loved the book and would recommend anybody who loves Stanley Kubrick or loves 2001. There's so much in there. It's such a treasure of material and stories, some of which we've touched on, but there are so many more in there. Well worth it.
Well, thank you so much, John. It was really a pleasure for me, too. And I hope we can keep up a connection and talk about other films at other times.
So that was my conversation with Michael Benson. I hope you enjoyed it. I was fascinated by what Michael had to say, not only about Stanley Kubrick, but also about Terrence Malick towards the end. Some real interesting facts and stories and witness statements that Michael has managed to gather together in his wonderful book, Space Odyssey, Stanley Kubrick, Arthur C. Clarke, and the Making of a Masterpiece. His recommended book is a book by Chilean author Benjamin Labatut, When We Cease to Understand the World, and I've read this also. One of my favorite books of last year, so also highly recommended. Yeah, a brilliant read. Really, really deep, really, really interesting, and quite funny at times as well. So that's all for Writers on Film this week. Next week we'll be talking to Ghibliotheque, so please remember to tune in. Thanks very much to Elliot Atkins for the music. Thank you, Ali Howard, for the artwork. And have a really good Christmas, a really good break. You deserve it.